No government prints money believing it is about to destroy its own currency. And that is perhaps the most uncomfortable part of this whole story, because at the moment the decision is made, it never seems radical, never seems irresponsible, and almost always emerges as the most sensible alternative within a set of even worse options. In Germany in the early 1920s, printing money didn't seem like a historical mistake, but a desperate attempt to keep the state functioning for one more day, one more week, one more month, while everything around it threatened to collapse. And that's exactly how it all begins. Out of greed, not out of badness, but out of urgency. World War I had ended, but for Germany, the war continued, only in another form. Now fought within government offices, central banks, closed rooms where numbers were discussed with more intensity than battles had been discussed in the trenches. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed reparations that were not only heavy, but practically unpayable. And the new German state, still fragile and trying to define itself, had to pay in gold or foreign currency, while its own economy could barely stay afloat. The problem wasn't just the external debt, but what was happening inside the country. Soldiers returned from the front without work. Factories operated below capacity. Strikes were occurring with increasing frequency. And the fear of a communist revolution hung over every political decision like a constant shadow. The state needed to pay salaries, maintain basic services, sustain some level of social order, and it needed to do it now, not in theory, not in the long term, but within the next week. And when money isn't enough, time becomes the most dangerous enemy. Within the government and the Reichsbank, the German central bank, the logic seemed clear and almost impossible to dispute at that specific moment. If the state failed to pay its employees, if it failed to maintain the minimum functioning of the economy, social collapse would occur even before any external solution could be negotiated. Printing money was not seen as a permanent solution, but as a bridge, a temporary measure, something that would buy time until the economy recovered or the repairs were renegotiated. And here comes the man who gives shape to this story. It's not as a cartoonish villain, but as an administrator pressured by forces that seemed greater than himself. At the heart of the decision-making process was the leadership of the Reichsbank, surrounded by politicians who demanded immediate results and by a population that no longer accepted abstract promises about the future. The order was simple: keep the country running. The printer started working. First, almost nothing seemed to change. More money in circulation meant salaries paid, bills settled, some temporary relief on the streets. Prices were rising, it's true. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, and there was always a plausible explanation for it. Someone always pointing to external factors, to speculators, to the scarcity caused by the war. And then the first silent loop in history appears, because every time money seemed to lose some of its value, the natural response was to print a little more, not out of carelessness, but because stopping at that specific moment seemed far more dangerous than continuing. To shut down meant cutting wages, reducing public spending, facing even larger strikes, and perhaps provoking the very revolution everyone feared avoiding. Money gradually ceased to be a measure of value and became a tool for political survival. By 1921, inflation was no longer just a distant economic phenomenon, but something that was beginning to be felt in everyday life. Prices were rising faster than before, but still within a range that allowed for cost-cutting. The authorities insisted that the situation was under control, that it was a temporary adjustment, and that the economy would soon find a new equilibrium. But money doesn't work with promises. The more banknotes that were printed, the less each banknote represented, and the less it represented. The more banknotes were needed to fulfill exactly the same functions as before. This cycle was unplanned, but once it began, it became extremely difficult to interrupt, because each future decision needed to compensate for the effects of the previous one. For long, salaries began to be paid more frequently, first monthly, then weekly, and eventually daily. Not because workers were getting richer, but because money was losing value so quickly that waiting more than a few hours meant losing real purchasing power. People started racing against the clock. They would receive their payment and immediately go to the market, not to buy more, but to buy before the prices were readjusted again. Restaurants changed their prices midday, shops hesitated to accept the national currency, and long-term contracts became virtually impossible to secure. And yet, the official response remained the same. More printing. Because now the problem was no longer just keeping the state functioning, but dealing with the consequences of the inflation that had been created. High prices required higher wages. Higher wages required more money in circulation, and each attempt to correct the effect only deepened the cause. This is the point where the story ceases to be merely economic and becomes profoundly psychological. Trust, an invisible but essential element of any monetary system, has begun to disappear. People no longer trusted that the money they received today would have the same value tomorrow. And when trust is broken, no amount of printed paper is enough to restore it. At that moment, something curious happens. The government realizes that stopping the printing of money would not immediately solve the problem, because the entire system had already adapted to inflation. To stop would mean causing a sudden collapse, a violent shock, perhaps even more destructive than continuous inflation. And so, continuing to print came to seem not only the easiest option, but the only politically viable one. This is where the state crosses an invisible but decisive point. Because the decision is no longer to print or not to print, but to print enough to survive until tomorrow. And when the decision-making horizon is reduced to days or hours, the long term ceases to exist. By 1923, the situation had completely escaped any theoretical control. The value of the German mark was plummeting at a rate that made any calculation virtually useless. Banknotes were printed in ever larger denominations, first thousands, then millions, then billions. Without this bringing any real sense of relief, there are reports of people using money as fuel for campfires, because paper money was worth less than the wood needed to heat their homes. Children played with wads of banknotes as if they were toys, while adults watched their life savings disappear in a matter of weeks. Even in this scenario, the initial momentum remained recognizable. The state still needed to pay salaries. It still needed to work. I still needed to avoid immediate collapse. If you've made it this far, you realize that this story isn't just about Germany in the 1920s, but about a pattern that repeats itself whenever governments face impossible choices between immediate collapse and gradual degradation. If this type of analysis helps you see beyond simplistic explanations about money and power, consider subscribing to the channel, because this logic doesn't belong only to the past. But the story isn't over yet. With the currency destroyed, the German economy entered a state of paralysis, disguised as frenetic activity. There was plenty of money, but nothing he could buy with certainty. People sought refuge in real assets, in foreign currencies, in anything that could not be multiplied by decree. And then, finally, came the attempt to stop. The introduction of a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed not by gold, but by real assets, was an attempt to rebuild something that had been completely eroded: trust. The print run was drastically reduced, and for a brief moment, the chaos began to subside. But the cost had already been paid. The middle class has been virtually wiped out. Savings disappeared. The feeling of institutional betrayal has spread deeply throughout society. And here's one last loop, perhaps the most dangerous of all. Because when money ceases to be reliable, people start looking for solutions outside the system. Leaders who promise order, stability, and revenge. Hyperinflation alone does not create extremism, but it prepares the psychological ground for radical ideas to seem reasonable. The man who authorized the printing of money didn't wake up one day determined to destroy the currency. He tried to save the state with the tools he had at his disposal, under pressures that few would want to face. And that's exactly what makes this story so unsettling. Because it wasn't an obvious mistake, nor an absurd choice, but a sequence of coherent decisions within a system that rewarded postponing immediate collapse, even if it meant amplifying future disaster. Weimar Germany was not an isolated historical accident. It was an extreme demonstration of something that happens whenever money is treated as a political solution to structural problems. And every time this story is told, it seems distant, exaggerated, almost impossible to repeat, till the day it starts repeating itself again, step by step, decision by decision. Always with the same initial justification: there was no other option.